All right, y'all. So I've decided to take a little recourse from what the original plan was going to be for this series, which was going to include me talking about topics like Ragnar Lothbrok and his descendants, as well as other prominent so-called Vikings or Scandinavian figures during the Viking Age. But I feel like it is more important to lay the groundwork for what my next series are going to be about, which are about the various dynasties in England and us figuring out what the figures from those ruling families truly look like in history. So I just feel like that it is better to kind of use this video as a prologue to the series that I have coming up next, which will be about the Normans and the start of their dynastic rule of England, as well as the British Isles in general from the medieval time period well into the late 1700s. So that is why, again, I'm taking a recourse from the original topics I was going to do videos on, but I'll probably revisit those topics later on down the line when I do another series about the Vikings. But now let's get into the topic of this video, which, as you should be able to tell by the title, is going to be primarily an investigation into what the origins of the people known to history as the Normans are, and what group of so-called Vikings or Scandinavians mainly inhabited the area in France known as Normandy, along with the other lands that were given to the incumbent group of Vikings that started to become more pervasive all throughout northern France. But more importantly, we're going to get into what the origins of the progenitor for most of the royal dynasties in places like England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales were, and try and see if we can answer the question of whether or not the figure known to history as Rollo, or according to some Icelandic writers, he was known as Hrolf Granger or Hrolf the Walker. We're going to figure out if he was Danish or Norwegian. For whatever reason, this is something that has puzzled historians for years pertaining to the origins of Rollo. But when you just do even a rudimentary amount of research on Rollo and what the most likely origin is for him, according to primary sources like his own descendants and their own personal historian, who we'll take a look at in a little bit here. But according to primary sources closest to Rollo, he was Danish, and we should already know what the importance of identifying Rollo as Danish is, because it will assist us in understanding what Rollo truly looked like, as well as what the Normans from Normandy as well as a whole looked like as well. And I've already shown a medieval manuscript image of what these Normans looked like according to the people that they raided and attempted to take the bulk of northern France from themselves. This manuscript that clearly depicts the Normans or Vikings as a people of color was created by the French. I believe it's entitled Illustrations de la Vie de Saint Aubin de Angers, and it depicts the Normans in France, particularly in the area of France known during that time period as Brittany, seemingly on their way to conquer a city within Brittany known as Grenade. And there is a historical basis behind this image that we'll go over later on in this video, so we'll get more information on that so that we can confirm that these were indeed the Normans and this was in fact what they looked like. So before we get into what we're going to see for this video, I just want to let you guys know that this will not be a regular video where I hone in mainly on the physical appearance of the historical figures I will be referencing. It's going to be more of a, like I stated earlier, an investigation into the origins of the Normans, so I can lay the groundwork for what will be seen in later series pertaining to the rulers of the medieval time period. But now let's get into first learning a little bit more about who Rollo was and what his origins were. So let's start out by reading this Wikipedia excerpt to see where the theories for Rollo either being of Danish or Norwegian ancestry originate from, and please pay attention to the sources that state Rollo was Danish as opposed to the ones who state that he was Norwegian, because as you'll notice, the earliest chroniclers of Rollo's origins will make it perfectly clear where he comes from, but we'll get into the deeper analysis as to why so many historians and scholars are befuddled by what these early chroniclers state. But let's read this excerpt down here. So Rollo was born in the mid-9th century, as his tomb states that he was in the 80s when he died in 933. His place of birth is almost definitely located in the region of Scandinavia, although it is uncertain whether he was Danish or Norwegian. In part, this disparity may result from the indifferent and interchangeable usage in Europe at the time of such terms as Vikings, Northmen/Norsemen, Norse, Swedes, Danes, Norwegians, and so on. And so this last sentence right here is where the consternation comes in when trying to identify what Rollo's origins were, due to the fact that allegedly there was no distinction that was made between the different Scandinavian populations at the time. And so according to most historians, this means that we can't know for sure whether or not Rollo was truly Danish, Norwegian, or anything else, even though he was specifically called a Dane in the earliest chronicles that documented his lineage. But we'll get into that in a minute, and also see that the term Northman could and a lot of the times did just mean the Danes. But let's read further on. So the earliest well-attested historical event associated with Rollo is his part in leading the Vikings who besieged Paris in 885 to 886, but were fended off by Otto of France. So that is a very important event that we'll go over extensively in this video. The siege of Paris in 885 to 886. But let's skip down a little bit here and start at among biographical remarks. So among biographical remarks about Rollo written by the late cleric Dudo of San Quentin in the late 10th century, he claimed that Rollo, the Dane, was from Dacia. And please remember this place name of Dacia, because it will be essential in figuring out the exact location of Rollo's origins, as was attested to by this guy right here, Dudo of San Quentin, who was one of, if not the earliest chroniclers of Rollo's exploits and life. But anyway, it goes on to say, a blend of the Latin for Denmark, Danea, and Sweden, Suecia. So it's because allegedly Dacia has been proven to be a Latin term that denoted all of Scandinavia, from Denmark to Norway and even Sweden, that historians will try to state that Rollo being from Dacia was not any implication of him being from anywhere in particular in Scandinavia. But again, we'll get into that in a little bit here. But and had moved from there to the island of Scanza. One of Rollo's great grandsons and contemporary of Dudo's was known as Robert the Dane. So right here we can see that one of Rollo's descendants, who was actually known as Robert II, who was the Archbishop of Rouen in France, was referred to as Robert the Dane. Now again, we'll get into what this term Dane specifically meant in regards to the Vikings in general, as well as the ones from Normandy specifically, and how it was a term that could just denote a Scandinavian from wherever in that peninsula. But for the most part, a Dane was actually a person from Dacia was actually literally meant to be a Dane, and the Danes being called Northmen or Normans was a term that, when applied to the Danes, actually meant somebody from Denmark. But let's just keep reading. So, however, Dudo's Historia Normannium was commissioned by Rollo's grandson, Richard I of Normandy. So we see here it states that Rollo's grandson was the one who commissioned for Dudo of San Quentin to create the manuscript for Rollo's history that stated Rollo was a Dane. So someone with access to the actual genealogical history of Rollo and the Dukes of Normandy stated that he was a Dane. And not only that, but the rest of the sentence from this excerpt states that people with possible living memory of Rollo were also available to Dudo for him to write this description of Rollo's background and where he was from. And the other later medieval chronicler who actually came from the region Rollo was from, the region that Rollo settled in and his descendants came from in France, upheld the same stance that Dudo took, which was that Rollo was in fact a Dane. It wasn't until the much later English Benedictine monks like William of Malmesbury and Goffredo Malatera, if I'm not mistaken, and even the other later Icelandic writer like Snorri Sturluson, it wasn't until they came along and started to change the narrative surrounding Rollo's origins from being Danish to now all of a sudden being considered a Norwegian. But once again, the man who was actually born in and around the same time Rollo performed all of his exploits and had access to family members of Rollo's, closely related ones, I might add, because the descendant of Rollo's that first commissioned Dudo of San Quentin to write the recorded history of the Normans at that time was the son of Rollo's oldest son, William Longsword, and William Longsword was alive and aware of Rollo's exploits and deeds, which means that he also would have been made aware of Rollo's origins as well. And this knowledge pertaining to Rollo and where he came from had to have been passed down from Rollo to William, and then from William to Richard I of Normandy. So this is the kind of access Dudo had available to him. It may not have been 100% direct contemporary access, but it was the next best thing, or it is the next best thing, and surely it's more close in proximity to the truth than much later historians who never spoke to any of Rollo's family members, nor did they have any access to the type of records Dudo would have been made privy to. So it is safe to say that Dudo's account is by far the most reliable out of all the medieval chroniclers who wrote about Rollo and his life. So now that we understand that, let's go about answering another question that a lot of people have pertaining to how Dudo of San Quentin illustrated the origins of Rollo and where he came from. A lot of scholars and historians believe that Dudo of San Quentin held the position that Rollo was of Danish descent, due to Dudo stating that he hailed from a place called Dacia, which was a Latin disambiguation of the word Denmark, at least according to some. But the problem that a lot of historians have is that they do not know if Dacia was meant to indicate Denmark specifically, or if it was a word that was meant to imply all of the Scandinavian peninsula. This stems from the alleged lack of distinction the people of medieval Britain had between the Danes and the other quote-unquote Northmen from Scandinavia, which has led historians to believe that the term Dane or Danish and even Denmark were just synonyms for all of these Scandinavians at the time, whether they be Norwegian, Swedish, or Danish. And Denmark or Dacia was used as a synonym for the entire Scandinavian peninsula as a whole, and that is what Dudo of San Quentin supposedly meant when he stated that Rollo was from Dacia. But the thing is, Dudo actually makes it perfectly clear that Dacia was a completely separate term from Scandinavia, and he even uses a specific word for Scandinavia in his Historia Normanium to denote Scandinavia as a whole. But let's see what it is that I'm talking about, just so that we can understand that Dudo did in fact state that Rollo specifically came from Dacia or Denmark. All right, so now this is the English translation of the History of the Normans by Dudo of San Quentin, which was written in the late 10th century. And so let's first see where in this chronicle Dudo states that Rollo came from Denmark and was ultimately a Dane. So we'll start from this page right here on page 61. So now, when William, Duke of the Dacians, so please keep in mind that the person who Dudo is referring to here is William Longsword, who again was the father of Richard I of Normandy and was the son of Rollo. And he was the one, Richard I of Normandy, William Longsword's son, was the one who commissioned Dudo to write this historical chronicle on the history of his family and his people. And from the first couple of words here, we can see that Dudo refers to William Longsword not as the Duke of Normandy, which was what he is conventionally known as today, but as the Duke of the Dacians, aka the Duke of the Danes, who by now were the main inhabitants of certain areas in northern France like Rouen, and of course Normandy, and a lot of the other lands along the river of France, or along the river in France known as the Seine. So that right there is a good indicator of who the main demographic of Scandinavians that inhabited Normandy were. So just keep that in mind. By reading on. Here's this message from the Breton legation. He calls together the chiefs of the Normans to consult them over this matter. When they were assembled, he related to them the story of the surprising embassy. Then one Bernard, who shared the Duke William's confidence, and Botho, the head of his household, were amazed at these exchanges and said to all three, "This embassy's reply is surprising and unheard of, and to us astonishing. When in days gone by, we were expelled from Dacia with your father, Rollo." Okay, so we see here that I believe either the Norman nobleman Count Bernard or Botho states that not only was the father of William Longsword, who was of course Rollo from Dacia, but he also states that we, as in either implying just them or all of the Normans in Normandy and Rouen at the time, were expelled from Dacia. So once again, this should give us a little hint as to who the main group of Scandinavians were who inhabited Normandy and the other places in northern France. The Normans were given dominion over by the Emperor of West Francia at the time, who was Charles the Simple in 911. But just focusing on Rollo for now, we can clearly see that Dudo states that Rollo was in fact expelled from Dacia, which again just meant Denmark. But before we confirm that this is indeed true, I just want to show one more instance in this chronicle where Dudo states that Rollo came from Dacia or Denmark. So let's read just one more instance in this chronicle where Dudo gives us an understanding of where exactly Rollo came from. So let's start at the top here. So Duke Hugh returned to Paris in obedience to this interdiction and sent to King Louis, saying, "Why has what you freely gave to me been taken away?" The king answered, "The land of Normandy will never be subject to the protection of more than a single lord, nor is it right that what ought to be united should be divided. For when Rollo was banished from the confines of Dacia, he conquered this for himself in one piece, and it was not divided up by anyone thereafter. The Dacian people only knows how to serve one lord." So again, there's that little allusion at the end there as to who the people that were with Rollo when he went to France after he, like Dudo states multiple times all throughout this chronicle, was expelled from the land of Dacia or Denmark. So we see again here that Rollo is stated to have been from the land of Dacia. But just going back to what I said earlier, most historians and scholars believe that this term Dacia was talking about the entire Scandinavian peninsula as a whole. So this basically means that no one can be sure of where Rollo came from, because allegedly Dudo stating that he was from Dacia really meant that he could have been from any country within Scandinavia, whether it be Denmark, Sweden, or Norway. But like I said earlier, there is a word that Dudo uses that's separate from Dacia to indicate other Scandinavian lands or just the land of Scandinavia in general. So let's take a look and see what this word was. So let's read this right here to see that the word Dudo uses for Scandinavia, which was separate from the word that he used for Denmark, which was Dacia. So let's read. So then the king besieged and captured the cities and subjugated the people who were defying him, and Rollo could not bear to remain in Dacia. Okay, so here Dudo, I believe, is detailing the events that occurred leading up to him being kicked out of Dacia. And right here from this first sentence, he states that Rollo could not bear to remain in Dacia. So again, Dudo is letting us know that Rollo specifically came from Dacia. Okay, he was from this land known as Dacia. So now let's read on and see the other word he uses apart from Dacia. So he despaired of keeping his own thanks to the king, and went from 6 ships to the island of Scanza. All right, so Dudo references this island right here, which was called the island of Scanza, and this word Scanza is the term that Dudo used to indicate other lands within Scandinavia, right? You can kind of see the similarities there between the two words, but either way, this term Scanza was the word that Dudo used to either indicate another land within Scandinavia or just Scandinavia itself as a whole, okay? And we can clearly see that Dacia and Scanza are in reference to two totally different localities, since Dudo states that Rollo went from Dacia to the island of Scanza, which could just be indicative of Rollo moving from Dacia or Denmark to another area within the Scandinavian peninsula. So it's clear there that Scanza and Dacia are two totally disparate locations from one another, and the fact that Dudo took the time to specifically single out the land of Dacia or Denmark from the rest of the other Scandinavian lands should show us that this land Dacia had to be very specific in the overall story of Rollo. But before I go into what this term Scanza meant in further depth, I just want to scroll down a little bit here and see one more instance where Dudo makes a clear separation between Dacia and the island of Scanza. So let's read this quick excerpt that will once again just illustrate even further that Dacia was made distinct from the rest of Scandinavia by Dudo in his historical chronicle. So let's read some of this paragraph right here. So he lingered talking about Rollo right here. So sorrowfully on the land of Scanza for a long time. Okay, so we see again that Scanza is mentioned in an isolated sense. Okay, so but raging with anxious thoughts of tormenting hatred and planning to revenge himself on his enemies, and many of those whom the royal cruelty had driven from Dacia turned to him. So again, Dacia and Scanza are made out to be two totally different localities from one another. So now it should be clear that Dacia was its own separate entity from the island of Scanza, which just means Scandinavia. Now that's not to say that Dacia was not part of Scandinavia. Dacia being Denmark, of course, would mean that it was part of Scandinavia. But what I'm trying to point out is that the notion that Dacia was meant to act as a designation for all of Scandinavia and the countries that are included within that peninsula, like Norway, Sweden, and of course Denmark, is not true. At least not according to Dudo. So now that we know Scanza and Dacia were separate from one another, let's just learn a little bit more about these two terms, because they are very important in understanding where Rollo came from, which does in fact matter, because as I showed in my last video on the Danes, they did not look the same as other people within Scandinavia, particularly not the the Norwegians. As we saw, and as for those of you who didn't watch that video yet, I highly recommend that you go and watch that video first before you continue on with this one, to get the full context of everything I'm saying in this video. But as we saw from the last video, chroniclers who witnessed the Vikings plunder and raid their homeland when they were attacked by two separate groups of Vikings, namely the Danes and the Norwegians, they made a clear distinction between the two groups of Vikings in regards to color, more specifically their physical appearance and skin color, with the Norwegians being referred to as white or fair, and the Danes being referred to as black. Whether it be in the form of dub Gaul, dub Genti, or even the more outright and descriptive Gwer Duan, which quite literally meant the black men, or even the swarthy complexioned men, or even Negri Gentis, which the term Negri, as I was able to show, was an alteration of Neger, and it meant somebody or a group of people who were of a black or swarthy complexion. Okay, so it is clear that the Danes as a whole were a people of color, and so if they were a people of color, that would mean that Rollo, being of a Danish descent, would have been a man of color, or a so-called black man as well. So identifying where exactly Rollo came from and his origins is indeed very important for not only this video, but even moving forward for as long as we talk about the medieval time period, because he and the band of Viking raiders he traveled with to France and eventually were able to take Normandy, and later on a lot of the other areas in northern France, major areas like Aquitaine and Anjou. Those band of Vikings had a very large impact on the rulers in places like, of course, northern France, and then just France in general, but also, of course, England, and then eventually Scotland, Wales, and then to a degree Ireland, and then also Italy, Germany, and the Low countries like the Netherlands, and then Spain, etc. All of those lands, or all of those areas in Europe, were at some point in time ruled over by the same exact Normans who descended from Rollo and his band of Vikings that he went to France with. So their identification pertaining to what country in Scandinavia they come from does have a huge significance in us understanding the so-called black rulership of all over Europe during the Middle Ages. So that is why I'm taking such an intricate deep dive into the origins of this man and the people he was casted out of Dacia with. Okay, but anyway, let's look further into the origins of this word Scanza and even the word Dacia, and see where Dudo could have possibly gotten these words from. It's important to note that, like most medieval writers before and after him, Dudo wrote pretty much all of his historical chroniclings in the Latin language, which of course was the language of the Romans, who had a huge influence on most of the medieval empires during that time period, and especially the medieval chroniclers, who took after a lot of the historians from the Roman age. And it is from the Romans where we can get an understanding of what the origins of these two words, Scanza and Dacia, were. So let's see what the Roman historians used for these terms, and what they meant by these two terms, and how they would have an influence on how Dudo chose to designate the land of Denmark and the rest of Scandinavia in general. Alright, so now we're going to read a few sources that will better explain what that term Dudo used in his historical chronicle on Rollo and the Normans, that term Scanza, and what it meant, and even what the origins were of that term to refer to the whole of Scandinavia, because Dudo was definitely not the first person to use that term in reference to Scandinavia, and he most likely was even influenced by other writers more ancient than himself. So let's read this excerpt right here to see what the historical significance of this word Scanza was, or is. And so it says Scandinavia, comprising the present Sweden, Norway, Lapland, and Finnmark, was by the ancients thought to be an island, but it is well known to be a peninsula. And if you'll remember, Dudo actually referred to Scanza as an island multiple times, especially in the section we read where he details Rollo's expatriation out of Dacia, or Denmark, where he stated that he, Rollo, despaired of keeping his own thanks to the king, and went with 6 ships to the island of Scanza. Okay, so again, Scanza was referred to as an island by Dudo, and this excerpt details the ancients thought Scandinavia was an island as well, and this was probably a rule of thought that was held by the geographers and historians of the medieval time period too. So this is the first sign of synchronicity between the two words Scanza and Scandinavia. But let's read on. So it says it is by Pliny called Scandinavia, or Vossius, and after him Gronovius will have it Scandinavia, by Xenophon Lampascus, Baltia, by Timaeus, Basilia, and by Pythicus, Basilia, and sometimes Abalus. The writers of the Middle Ages style it Scanza, Scanzia, Scantia, and Scandia, which names as well as which names as well as that of Scandinavia. Okay, so right here it details how various different geographers and historians from Pliny, the ancient Greek geographer, to Middle Age authors, i.e. Dudo and others, refer to Scandinavia as a whole as Scanza. And we know that this is talking about Scandinavia as a whole because the first sentence starts out by telling the reader the different countries within the Scandinavian peninsula. So again, all these names that were created for the land of Scandinavia were meant to encompass the entirety of this peninsula. And amongst these various names, we can clearly see that Scanza, the same exact word Dudo used in his chronicle, was the word that he used to refer to Scandinavia. Okay, so yes, Scanza was meant to indicate Scandinavia as a whole, which would mean that Dacia could not have been the word that he used to denote all of the countries within Scandinavia, since he already utilized a word for that. So Dacia had to strictly only be one locality or one country. Okay, so but let's read something else to better understand where Dudo could have gotten this word to refer to Scandinavia as a whole from. Alright, so let's read this excerpt to see what Roman author could have influenced Dudo to use this word Scanza to refer to the entirety of this peninsula that we call today Scandinavia. So let's read. So the old geographer of Ravenna, who according to Gonovius wrote in the 8th century, says, and then this author goes on to translate what this geographer from the 8th century, okay, so this was another medieval author who we're going to see use this term Scanza to refer to Scandinavia. And again, he was an author from the 8th century, which was about a century before Dudo was even born. So again, this is another medieval author who utilized this term Scanza to refer to Scandinavia, just like what the last excerpt I read from stated the medieval authors during that time period used it for. But anyway, let's read how this was translated. So when the Northern Ocean is an island, remember the last excerpt that stated Scandinavia was once thought to be an island called Scanza, and a name always given by Jordanese and co or others to Scandinavia. Okay, so again, we see that Scanza was in fact a word used by not only medieval writers, but also the author of this book. He states that Jordanese, who was a 6th century Roman bureaucrat who was possibly of Germanic descent, but this guy right here, Jordanese, also used this term Scanza to refer to the entirety of Scandinavia. So this use of Scanza to denote Scandinavia went back to the time of this Roman/Gothic or German bureaucrat, and it probably went even further back than that. This term Scanza went even further back than that. But the point is that Scanza, even before Dudo, was used to denote Scandinavia. We already saw 2 examples of that just from this one book. So again, it should be obvious by now that Dacia was not the term Dudo was using to denote all of the Scandinavian countries. It was Scanza. Okay, so but I'll just show one last example from an author in the 19th century who was an actual cartographer, or somebody who creates and studies maps and geography, and he was actually one of the more well-known and knowledgeable cartographers of his era. So let's read what he has to say about this term Scanza and get further information on what this term meant. All right, so let's read this excerpt from the 19th century cartographer John Knox. So we find Skåne in Denmark, and Skånland in Norway, and Skånland in Norland, and Skånland in Finnmark. Scannon and Scanza were ancient names of Scandinavia, part of which is still called Scania, the Scandia of Ptolemy. All right, so again, this was just meant to act as extra confirmation that Scanza and Scandinavia were equivalent and this was from a person who actually studied the history of geography and most likely the terms that were meant to denote certain areas of the world. And this person actually says something very interesting. He states that during ancient times, Scanza was also used to denote Scandinavia. So again, even way before Dudo of San Quentin used the word Scanza to denote Scandinavia, other ancient authors used that term as well for this peninsula. So it's clear that Scanza was the word Dudo used for Scandinavia, and Dacia had to be in reference to another locality, but one that was specifically within the peninsula of Scandinavia, which is where of course Dacia comes in. So now that we have a better understanding of what Scanza means, let's just take a look at the locality Dudo states Rollo actually derived from, which of course was Dacia. So let's just see if this term Dacia was indeed a word that was only meant for the country of Denmark, and better understand that Rollo was in fact a Dane, or a quote-unquote negri gentis. Now let's see what kind of historical context encyclopedia.com can give us pertaining to what Dacia meant and what country in the Middle Ages it was meant to denote. So originally the name of a province in the Roman Empire north of the Danube was erroneously used for, during the Middle Ages as the Latin name for Denmark. So again, Dacia was not used for the entire Scandinavian peninsula. It was only used to denote Denmark and even the people of Denmark. This mistake, and then reading on, this mistake was first observed circa 1020 in the Chronicle of Dudo of Saint Quentin, but penetrated into Scandinavia circa 1100 AD. Okay, so encyclopedia.com not only helps us understand that Dacia during the Middle Ages meant Denmark, but also the first known instance where Dacia was quote unquote mistakenly used for Denmark, because just as an aside, for those of you who don't know, Dacia is actually the word that was used to denote the country we know today as Romania. So that is where the quote unquote mistake of using Dacia for Denmark comes from. But anyway, we see here that the first instance that Dacia was used in place of Denmark was from Dudo's historical chronicle on Rollo and the Normans. So what this is letting us know is that Dudo was in fact using Dacia as a way to imply the land of Denmark, and only Denmark, no other place within Scandinavia or Europe. So now that we have that, let's take a look at another source that will help us understand that this term Dacia was indeed just meant to denote Denmark during the Middle Ages. Now let's go about reading this rendition of a medieval chronicle that was written by an English Benedictine monk by the name of Rainulf Hijden around the 13th or 14th century. And the translator of this article in the introduction is going to give us an understanding of how this medieval English monk, as well as other medieval chroniclers, utilized the term Dacia. So the islands of the Atlantic, including the Baltic, follow upon these. The description of the Canaries or Fortunate Islands is taken from Pliny and Isidore, his account of Denmark, talking about the medieval monk that wrote this chronicle, which he and other medieval writers called Dacia. So this is an example right here of another medieval writer besides Dudo using the word Dacia to denote specifically Denmark. This obviously had to be something that was common knowledge amongst all of the medieval writers, which is why they all for the most part use this term Dacia for Denmark. But let's just see another instance where a medieval writer used the term Dacia specifically for Denmark. So this is a book that was written by a professor at Purdue University who also had ties to Oxford and St. Hilda's College in England. So this person is a good reference to use for information. But anyway, let's see what other medieval writer this author states the term Dacia was used to denote Denmark for. So the Dacians lived in Thrace, north of the Carpathian mountains, but in the Middle Ages, Dacia was identified with Denmark or the Danish settlements in Britain. And then he cites the famous 12th century Welsh historical writer Geoffrey of Monmouth, who is responsible in large part for most of the narratives pertaining to the mythical King Arthur. But what we can glean from this is that it states Geoffrey of Monmouth in his semi-historical chronicle Historia Regum Britanniae used the term Dacia specifically for Denmark. But let's take a look at this chronicle and see exactly where he states this. All right, so this is the famous semi-historical chronicle written by Geoffrey of Monmouth. So let's see at least one instance where he used the term or the word Dacia or Dacian within this chronicle. So here at the top of this chapter, the subheading reads, "The king of Dacia with Bernice's wife is released out of prison." So this is the first instance we see Dacia being used. But let's read some of this paragraph right here. So Belinus, after this victory, called a council of his nobility to advise with them what he should do with the king of the Dacians, who had sent a message to him out of prison that he would submit himself and the kingdom of Dacia to him. Okay, so we see this term Dacia being used a couple of times here in just this one paragraph, and then I believe it is mentioned once more at the very end of the paragraph. But now if you take a look at the side note, the translator of this chronicle states that the Danes pay tribute to Belinus, and from the original wording it states that the Dacians pay tribute to Belinus. But what the note is trying to help the reader understand is that Dacia in this context was meant to denote the Danes, i.e. the people of Denmark. So again, we see yet another medieval writer using the term Dacia to denote Danes or Denmark. And then I believe also in the index it states that that Dacia was used to denote Denmark as well. So we should see now from this excerpt that Geoffrey of Monmouth, yet another medieval writer, used the word Dacia to indicate the land of Denmark. And like all the sources I pulled from thus far have stated, during the medieval time period, Dacia was used for Denmark, according to most of the middle-aged writers, historians, and chroniclers at the time. And there were even an abundance of prominent scholars during this era that were given the epithet of from Dacia to let people know that they were indeed from Denmark. Figures such as the 13th century Danish philosopher Boetius of Dacia, aka Denmark, and then even the 13th century theologian Martin of Dacia, who was said to be specifically Danish, and then even Johannes de Dacia, or as he was also called John of Denmark. And then lastly, Petrus de Dacia, who was a 13th century mathematician and was also said to be of Danish descent as well. So it's clear this term Dacia was indeed meant to denote Denmark and only Denmark. And if for nobody else, we should know that Dudo used the term Dacia to specifically refer to Denmark, since he uses an entirely different word for all of Scandinavia, which we already identified as Scanza, right? So yes, Dudo had to have used the word Dacia for Denmark, thus making it so that Rollo, according to Dudo, who again had far more access to the origins and genealogical records than anyone who wrote about him during the medieval time period, which would make his account by far the most accurate in regards to where he came from and his origins. And other earlier chroniclers on the history of the Normans and Rollo, such as William of Juman, who was actually one of the earliest chroniclers of the Norman conquest of England in 1066, and also had contact with people who were descendants of Rollo, like the great-great-grandson of Rollo's, who was known as Richard III, Duke of Normandy, and was even a contemporary of William the Conqueror's. William of Juman was a contemporary of William the Conqueror's during the Norman conquest. So again, another man who had access to real, accurate genealogical records of Rollo's lineage stated that Rollo was in fact a Dane. Another chronicler by the name of Oderic Vitalis, who was a Benedictine monk and worked out of an abbey known as the Abbey of Saint Everard, which was an abbey in Normandy, upheld the same sentiments that William of Juman and Dudo stated about Rollo, which was that he was Danish. And then another writer who was a French poet from Tours, France, by the name of Benoit Saint-Maur, stated that Rollo was born in a town in Denmark known as Fosswege, if I'm not mistaken, which has been translated to the modern Danish town of Fox in Zealand, which is in Denmark. And then there was even an anonymous writer who wrote, who was again born within the confines of France, which is of course the exact same place that Rollo made his most significant mark at, and where all of his descendants who claimed to be the Dukes of Normandy and Rohan in the place known as Bethune were from. This writer was from the place in northern France known as Bethune. And this is where Normandy was located at. Normandy was located in northern France, which is in the same region as this anonymous writer was said to have come from. But this person who came from this region in Bethune in France, he also stated that Rollo was in fact a Dane. So we have multiple statements made by people who actually lived in the same place Rollo resided in. And in the case of Dudo, someone who had actual access to not so distant family members of his who would have had a close remembrance of Rollo and his origins, they all state that Rollo was a Dane and a native of Denmark. The only ones who claimed that Rollo was not Danish were, for number one, much later chroniclers like Snorri Sturluson, who was a chronicler from the 13th century, which was way after the exploits of Rollo occurred, and he was an Icelandic writer, i.e. he was far from France, which is where most of the information of Rollo and the records of his life would have been available at, since he settled there, and since that would be where the rest of his family resided at up until William the Conqueror in 1066. But guys like Snorri Sturluson, who most of the credit is given to for identifying Rollo as a Norwegian, did not have access to primary sources like Dudo had, and also did not live anywhere near in the same location or the same time period as Rollo did. So he is not a good authority to go off of. And even others like William of Malmesbury, who again was born way after the exploits of Rollo, but also was not born anywhere near France or Normandy. He was born in England. Okay, so the most primary and closest sources we have to Rollo say that he was was indeed Danish. So with him now being identified as a man of Danish descent, we can now start to understand what his descendants must have looked like, seeing as though the Danes were always referred to as a people of color no matter where they went. Go and check out my last video to get the entire scope of what I'm talking about with the Danes and how they were almost always referred to as black from many different sources in many different ways. One of the ways we can also tell that the Danes were people of color, and this is something that I briefly mentioned at the end of my last video, but one of the other ways we can tell that the Danes were people of color is by taking a look at the men that Rollo went to France with. The vast majority of the Vikings that strove with Rollo were of Danish descent as well. I believe I referenced in this video earlier that when I showed the dialogue in Dudo's chronicle between William Longsword, who was called the Duke of the Dacians, right, and other nobles from Normandy, who both stated that they were casted out of Dacia, they were casted from Dacia with William's father, who was of course talking about Rollo. So if Rollo was Danish and came from Denmark, and the men that went with him to France also came from Denmark, then they would have had to have also been Danish as well, right? Well, let's see if that is indeed the case and see what these Danish soldiers that went with Rollo would have looked like. Alright, so let's figure out what the army of Rollo mainly comprised of in terms of their nationality and where they came from in Scandinavia, because like I've stated all throughout this video, it does in fact matter which Scandinavian country Rollo and his army, who will go on to become the main inhabitants of Normandy and the ancestors of the vast majority of the Normans that established kingdoms all over Europe, from England to Italy and even in the Middle East to Africa. The Normans' influence spread across continents, and their rulership in a lot of the places that they established kingdoms in lasted for centuries, and also some of the most well-known rulers in England and even Scotland and Wales, and then to a degree France, were of Norman descent. So in order for us to gain a better understanding of what a lot of these people in history truly looked like, we have to go back to the source of where they came from, and the way we do that is by looking at those series of events that occurred in the early portion of the 10th century in northern France, and how those people who were involved in these events were described and even depicted in art from that time period. So we'll get into that in a minute, but first let's identify who the main inhabitants of Normandy were after Rollo and his army had been granted the lands that were given in northern France. So we'll start out by reading some of this Briticana article. So according to later Scandinavian sagas, Rollo, making himself independent of King Harold I of Norway, sailed off to raid Scotland, England, Flanders, and France in pirating expeditions. Early in the 10th century, Rollo's Danish army attacked France, and he established himself in an area along the Seine River. And we'll stop there. But we see that according to Briticana, Rollo's army was in fact Danish. And this is something that a lot of historians and scholars would do when it comes to Rollo. They'll claim that they don't know where Rollo came from, and that it's such a mystery if he was Danish or Norwegian, but then they'll acknowledge that the vast majority of Rollo's army was Danish and came from Denmark. So logically, if Rollo led a group of Danish Vikings into France, and if the main group of people that left with him to his expedition to France after he was kicked out of the Scandinavian country he was kicked out of were Danish, shouldn't that be a good indicator of what his origins were? Like I showed from Dudo's chronicle, when Rollo's son William Longsword was talking with a couple of Norman noblemen, the nobles stated that they were kicked out of Dacia or Denmark with Rollo, right? So Rollo already had a crew of Danish men that went with him after he was kicked out of Denmark, which would only make sense considering who was documented being alongside Rollo at the time of his conquest in northern France. So let's look at another source that can give us more of an understanding of who mainly comprised of Rollo's army. Alright, so now let's read what this book has to say regarding the origins of Rollo's army. And this book was written by an early 1900s British archaeologist and historian by the name of Sir Thomas D. Kendrick. So let's read what he states about Rollo's army. It must be held, therefore, as most likely, though not proven with certainty, that Rollo was Norwegian. So this is one of those guys that maintains the belief that Rollo was Norwegian, albeit very hesitantly, but it seems he believes in Rollo's Norwegian ancestry, which we should already know is untrue. But let's see what he has to say about his army. But whether he was Norwegian or Danish, there can be no doubt that the bulk of the army he commanded was composed of Danish Vikings. Okay, so we see even a historian who was more of the belief that Rollo was of Norwegian Norwegian ancestry rather than Danish ancestry, he still upholds, or he still withholds, the understanding that the as he puts it, bulk of Rollo's army, meaning most if not all of his army, was comprised of Danish Vikings. Okay, so this is yet another piece of confirmation that these men who came over to France with Rollo were Danish. So now let's look at a couple more sources to confirm that this is indeed true. Alright, so now let's read the very well-known book on the Vikings history written by Welsh historian Wyn Jones and see what he has to say about Rollo's army, just to get even more confirmation that they were indeed Danish. So much of the evidence on both sides is obviously unreliable. The main Danish authority is the notorious Dudo, but the nationality of the leader is less important than that of his army. And the reason why this author says this is because, as we'll see in a little bit, the army of Rollo would eventually come to make up the bulk of the population in Normandy, which, like I said earlier, will become one of the most dominant people in Europe all throughout the medieval time period and beyond, especially after the Norman conquest of England in 1066. So once again, that is why it is important to understand where Rollo's army came from. But anyway, let's read on. So which there is every reason to believe was predominantly Danish. Okay, so now it should be clear that Rollo and his army were comprised of people from Denmark, or they were Danes. And like I said a little bit ago, this army would make up the bulk of the Norman population, who would go on to help William the Conqueror conquer England and establish the Norman dynasty out there, that really would have reverberations all throughout, all the way until the end of the Stuart line in England, who were mostly of Norman descent themselves. So that is almost 1,000 years of dominance by these Normans within the British Isles and beyond, that persisted all throughout that time period. So again, that is why we need to understand who these men were in the army of Rollo. But let's just confirm that the bulk of the Norman population was indeed composed of these same quote-unquote Danish Vikings that helped Rollo take over the vast majority of northern France. Before I remind you guys of what these Danish Vikings looked like, more specifically though, the Danish Vikings that invaded France from with Rollo. Alright, so now let's read an excerpt out of this book to confirm what I've been saying pretty much throughout this entire video, which is that the vast majority of the peoples living within Normandy that came mainly from Rollo and his army and their settlement of Normandy were mainly of Danish extraction. So let's read this real quick here. So Norman tradition, at least as preserved by Dudo of San Quentin, claimed that Rollo was of Danish and not Norwegian origin. It seems likely that most of these Scandinavian settlers of Normandy were of Danish extraction. Okay, so the people of Normandy, or the Normans, were mainly of Danish extraction. All right, so now that we know where Rollo came from, as well as his army, and eventually where the ancestors of the Normans that would eventually go on to rule a vast empire in Europe that stretched all the way out to Africa and other places in the Middle East, we know now that they came from Denmark. Let's just become reacquainted with the understanding of what these Danish Normans looked like according to how they were depicted by the French. I've already shown this picture in my last video, but like I told you guys, this picture right here is going to be featured a lot moving forward with my series on medieval Europe, especially while I talk about the Normans and their dynasty in England. This picture right here from a manuscript made in and around 1050 to 1150 AD from France. This details a scene from an event that occurred during 919 AD, which was still while Rollo was alive, and where and this picture depicts Viking attackers. By now they could be referred to as Norman attackers, but they were on their way to raid a city that resided within the confines of Western France, known as Guenarde. And there's a bit of a backstory behind this image. Even though the event isn't necessarily that significant, there is still a local legend within this French city that states that this band of Normans were about to attack and take this city, along with the region in France that was known back then as Brittany. And while in Brittany, they attempted to take little cities like this one right here in Guenarde and claim them as their own. So the story goes that the people of Guenarde took refuge in a church and prayed to Saint Albinus of Angers, who I believe was like the patron saint of that city, or he may have been like the patron saint of all of Brittany. I forget exactly which one, but they prayed to him, and allegedly Saint Albinus of Angers showed them a sign that gave them enough courage to go up against these Normans right here and attempt to try and thwart them away from their city. And this attempt ended up being successful, and it resulted in this group of Normans right here being driven out of the city of Guernarde. So this was a documented event that actually occurred in history, and the way in which the French decided to depict the Normans right here to tell us all we need to know about what the Normans as a whole looked like, since they were all a part of the same group. Remember, all of the Normans were Danes. Okay, the Danes, as I showed in my last video, were documented all throughout the so-called Viking Age by multiple different people from the British Isles as being a people of color. And just in case you guys need a reminder, I'll briefly go over again what a lot of these Danes were called by the peoples of Britain before we close this video out, because before I do that, like I referenced earlier, this event occurred while Rollo was still alive. This event that this manuscript illustrates right here, it occurred while Rollo was still alive. And even though Rollo and his group of Danes that he came over to Normandy with were done raiding that area, they still made their way to other areas within France, one of them being the peninsula within northwestern France known as Brittany, which is where this city Guernarde was located in. And there is documented historical proof that Rollo the Dane and his Danish Vikings were indeed in Brittany, and around the exact same time this illustration of the Normans attacking Guernarde was said to have taken place. So let's just read something real quick to confirm that this is indeed true. So let's read an excerpt from this book that will help us connect the dots between the illustration of Norman soldiers that were coming over to raid the city of Guernarde in Brittany, and Rollo, who we've already seen was a Dane, and his army were composed of mostly Danes, and how this illustration is basically just a microcosm of what the entire Norman population that inhabited Normandy at the time looked like, as well as what Rollo himself and his descendants looked like as well. So let's read this real quick here. So there is no reason to deny the possibility of Rollo and William Longsword attacking the Britain coast, meaning Brittany. The Chronicle of Nantes. So this chronicle that this book is referencing, was a late 11th century chronicle made in Nantes, France. So right within the same region in Western France that a lot of this stuff was going on in. Okay, so just keep that in mind. But anyway, reading on, the Chronicle of Nantes very clearly identifies the diabolical Vikings from Rouen. Now, Rouen was the area within northern France that Charles the Simple, king of West Francia at the time, appointed to Rollo and made him the count of. The count was basically just like a title of nobility. But so Rouen was the place where Rollo would have been coming from if he were to venture out and raid other areas within France or wherever else. Okay, so this is just another sign that the Norman army I showed that illustration of was most likely part of the raiding group Rollo was leading into Brittany. So they are an example of who Rollo and his Danish Vikings, the same ones who helped him to gain Normandy, would have looked like. But let's read what the rest of this sentence says. So from Rouen by boat and devastated all Brittany in when 1919. So 1919 was the exact date that this manuscript stated the raid on Guernarde happened, and according to this book, this was the exact same year the Normans, led by either Rollo or his son William Longsword, led the Vikings into Brittany. So which is where again the city of Guernarde was located. So this is most likely a group of Vikings, by now Normans, right, who came over to France and were expelled from their homeland in Denmark, right, along with Rollo, and were a part of the Danish army that helped Rollo raid and eventually be given the lands of Rouen, and then also Normandy and other places within that area of northern France. And just like the book I referenced earlier states, the main population of Normans coming out of Normandy were Danish Vikings from Denmark, or remember Dacia, right? And so if you guys need any reminder of what the Danes were described as looking like, here are a few reminders real quick. So one of the names the Danes were given by the Welsh was Gwerduon, which according to their translations meant the black men. And another translation was also the swarthy men, which indicates that they were given this name of Gwerduon to denote their skin color, okay, or what their skin color was. So there's Gwerduon, and then there's also Dub Gaul, which according to the Irish meant black foreigners, and was also again in reference to skin color. And this is according to 19th century Irish historian and archivist John Thomas Gilbert, who stated that the Dub Gaul meant literally a black or dark complexion foreigner. Okay, that was an Irish historian who stated that from the 19th century. And then according to another Irish historian by the name of James Horan, he stated that the word dub Gaul meant swarthy in complexion. Okay, and then one last Irish historian that I'll quote is Malachi Hatchery, who I believe he was also Irish too, but he stated that the term dub Gaul and the people who were called that, as opposed to the people who were called Fingal, were two totally different races, and that one was darker and the other one was of a fair complexion. Okay, and then also the famed 19th century Irish writer by the name of Thomas More himself also stated that the Danes and the Norwegians, i.e. the dub Gaul and the Fingal, were a completely different race from one another, meaning they looked totally different. And he stated that one of them was darker and the other one was far lighter in complexion, or far fairer in complexion, hence why they were called the fair Gaul as opposed to the dub Gaul. Okay, and then one last name I'll bring up that the Danes were called was Negri Gentis, or even Gentibiles Negris. Now we should already know from the last video that Negris was a plural form of the Latin word negere, and as I was able to show through examples of figures in history and even mythology who were referred to as Negri, who were also referred to as Negri, figures such as Memnon from Homer's Iliad, and even Simeon de Niger, who was mentioned in the scriptures in Acts the 13th chapter. They were both called these names of Niger because of their complexion. And also I showed that the name that was given to the Moors of North Africa, that being Mori, was a word that was equivalent to Negri, according to the same exact people who called the Danes black foreigners, right? The medieval Irish. And I already showed what these Moris looked like. Okay, they look like this. And then even this. Okay, and then even this. And if you guys need a reminder of what this term negris or negri and even negir meant, here is a definition right here. It was a word that indicated black or a swarthy complexion, okay, or being of a black or swarthy complexion, okay. So all of these words that describe the Danes obviously were given to them to indicate that they were indeed a people of color, i.e. so-called black people, which would mean that the Normans, since their ancestors were the Danes, would have been of the exact same extraction, or excuse me, of the exact same appearance. Okay, so yes, the Normans were so-called black people, just as they are shown right here. Okay, these people right here, these are Normans. And before I close this video out, I just want to call somebody out who was in my comments in the last video, who stated that this group of Normans did not look like so-called black people, and that if I thought these were so-called black people, I was too far gone to reason with. Well, to that person, if you're watching this video, let me ask you something, bro. And you guys who are also watching this video as well, y'all can comment this under the video, or I may make a poll in the community tab asking this question. But please help me out with something. Does this illustration of the Normans who attacked Brittany for number one not depict black people? Okay, I'll show close-ups right here. Okay, so you guys can see their facial features and not just their skin color. But if this does not depict so-called black people and make it clear that these are so-called blacks, or that the Danes and the Normans, eventually who would become the Normans, were so-called blacks, then what else? What other group, what other racial group is this depiction supposed to show right here? Does this depict Caucasians? Are you really saying that this depicts Caucasians? The person who commented that dumb stuff underneath my last video, claiming that these were not so-called blacks, if you're watching this video, you know exactly who you are. Do you honestly think that if this picture right here were to be held side by side with one of the fake forged pictures of Vikings that allegedly depicted them in illuminated manuscripts as so-called Caucasian, just like this one right here, do you honestly think that the alleged so-called Vikings from this alleged manuscript image are of the same race or ethnicity as the Normans who are depicted in this illuminated manuscript right here? I mean, I don't know, man. You answered that question for me. And again, I'll probably make a poll asking this question as well in the community tab. But to me, these are clearly so-called black men. There's no question about it. And this picture, along with this whole video, will help moving forward in understanding that the dynasties that proceeded forth from the kingdom that Rollo established and his group of Danish Vikings established, kingdom that they were able to carve out within Normandy that ended up becoming known as the Norman dynasty in England, eventually in 1066, and then later on the Plantagenet dynasty, which encompassed England as well as a lot of areas in France outside of Normandy, areas like most of Aquitaine, and then Anjou, which is where the Plantagenets came from, as well as other areas within northern France, and eventually places like Scotland, Wales, and I believe Ireland as well. All those places fell under the rulership of the Norman Plantagenets, okay, or at least half Norman Plantagenets. And then after them sprung forth the Welsh/Norman Tudors, with rulers like King Henry VIII and Edward VI and his sister Elizabeth I, who was one of the greatest monarchs in all of English history. Elizabeth I was. And then after the Tudors, the Norman blood persisted on down to the dynasty that King James established, which united all of England, Scotland, Ireland, and even Wales, and created what we know of today as the United Kingdom of Britain. Okay, and then other rulers from the so-called Stuart line included people like Charles I of England and his sons, Charles II, aka the Black Boy, and then Charles II's brother, King James VII/II, who eventually lost the Stuart crown for a time until it was regained by Queen Anne, who I already showed in one of my previous videos, in the previous prologue video to the medieval series that I'm making right now. Queen Anne, she was quite literally during her time called by a contemporary of hers. She was quite literally called by a contemporary of hers as a so-called black woman. Okay, and then after her, of course, the Stuarts tried to regain control of the realms that they had previously ruled over under the quote-unquote so-called old pretender Prince James III, who really in reality looked like this. Okay, this is obviously a so-called black man, and his lineage persisted on down to his son, but his son tried to also regain the Stuart line on the English throne, but there was to no avail. But the point is that all of these rulers and even the nobility from all of these dynasties that came to that came to rule England and much of the British Isles, as well as France and even beyond the reaches of Europe, all of these rulers descended from this one man right here, Rollo, and his band of Vikings, who were again of Danish extraction, right? All of these rulers and nobles that descended from these Normans right here look just like this. Okay, just like how these Normans invaded the coast of Brittany, led by the forefather of the Normans, Rollo, they all look like this. Okay, and as we move to a close for this video, move on to finally talking about the medieval dynasties in Europe for my next series, we now have laid a firm foundation for the understanding we should have of what the ruling class in Europe looked like moving forward. So I'll be sure to remind you guys of this photo as we move forward, talking about the famous William the Conqueror and his sons who ended up ruling after him, and set the stage for the enthralling, captivating, tumultuous, chaotic, inspiring, and most of all, revelatory time period we're about to dive into.